It was a sunny afternoon, and the air was filled with the sound of chatter as tourists wandered around a famous historical site. This place was known for its rich history, beautiful architecture, and the unique sight of royal guards stationed throughout the area. The guards, dressed in their traditional uniforms, stood tall on horseback, keeping a watchful eye over everything. These guards were not only there to protect the site, but they also represented centuries of tradition, discipline, and honor. Their horses, strong and majestic, were just as much a part of the ceremony as the guards themselves. Among the crowd of curious visitors, a young tourist had just arrived. Full of excitement, he couldn't wait to take in the sights and learn about the rich culture that surrounded him. He had seen pictures online of the royal guards, but seeing them in person was something entirely different. The horses, with their shiny coats and tall, proud postures, stood out in a way that made him feel like he was witnessing history firsthand. He moved eagerly through the crowd, trying to capture every moment with his camera. But then, something caught his eye. The horses, standing so still and poised, almost seemed like statues. To him, they appeared docile and harmless. And that's when an idea came to his mind. An idea that would soon lead to trouble. The tourist glanced around to see if anyone was paying too much attention to him. He noticed the guards were focused on their duties, but the horse he was closest to stood with its head lowered slightly, as if in deep thought. It looked peaceful, maybe even tired, which made him think it was fine to approach it. The young man was unaware of the seriousness behind the horses and their role. The temptation to get a closer look, to take a better photo, was too strong. So, without thinking much about it, he took a small bottle of water from his bag. He had seen some other tourists splash water playfully on their faces to cool off in the hot sun. Why not do the same, he thought. Just a quick splash to get a unique photo of the horse with the water droplets reflecting the sunlight. He figured it would be harmless, just a bit of fun. He crept closer to the horse, the water bottle in his hand, making sure no one was watching too closely. Then, with a quick movement, he splashed the water towards the horse's face. The water hit the horse's muzzle, and for a brief moment, nothing happened. The young tourist chuckled to himself, pleased with his decision. He thought it would make for an interesting shot. But what he didn't know was that the horse wasn't just any ordinary animal. It was trained to respond to certain commands, and its role as a royal guard horse made it highly sensitive to any sudden movements or disturbances. The splash of water, although harmless in his eyes, startled the horse, and for a brief moment, its body stiffened. The horse's large, dark eyes flashed with a hint of confusion and irritation, and its ears pricked up. The young tourist didn't notice these subtle signs of distress. He was too focused on the angle for his photo, too caught up in the excitement of the moment. Then, as the horse shifted uneasily, the tourist saw something he hadn't expected. The guard on horseback, who had been watching over everything calmly, shifted his posture. His hand, which had been resting on the reins, tightened around them. The guard's eyes locked onto the tourist with a piercing gaze, one that made the young man's stomach twist with sudden apprehension. He hadn't meant to cause any trouble, but he could sense that something was wrong. The guard's gaze didn't waver. He didn't say anything at first. The young tourist felt a chill run down his spine. He had been so caught up in the moment that he hadn't stopped to think about how his actions might affect the horse or the guard. The laughter in the crowd around him seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of tense silence. Some people turned to watch, sensing the shift in the air, as if they too could feel the tension building. As the guard slowly dismounted from his horse, the tourist felt his heart race. He suddenly realized the mistake he had made. He hadn't just splashed water at the horse. He had disrupted the delicate balance of the guard's duties. The horse, now uneasy and shifting its weight, seemed to be signaling that it wasn't sure what to do. The guard, on the other hand, stood tall and calm, but there was a noticeable tension in his shoulders. He was waiting for something, a sign, a response, or maybe just the right moment to address the tourist. The crowd had begun to murmur. Some were watching in anticipation, while others were whispering to each other about the young tourist's actions. The young man, realizing he had made a mistake, looked around for a way to escape the uncomfortable situation he had put himself in. But it was too late. He knew he couldn't undo what he had just done. What was supposed to be a harmless, fun photo had turned into a situation that was now being watched by everyone. In the back of his mind, he understood that what he had done wasn't just a simple splash of water. It had disturbed something much bigger than he had anticipated. He had learned the hard way that some things, like royal guards and their horses, were not to be treated lightly. And little did he know, the lesson he was about to learn would be far more painful than he could have ever imagined. The guard slowly dismounted from his horse, and the sound of his boots hitting the ground seemed to echo in the tense silence. The young tourist stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as the realization of his mistake began to sink in. The guard's eyes were locked on him, and for the first time, the tourist understood the seriousness of the situation. He had been so careless, so caught up in the thrill of the moment, that he hadn't even thought about the consequences of his actions. The guard's movements were calm but deliberate. He didn't rush, and he didn't shout. He walked toward the tourist with a measured pace, his eyes still focused on him, with an intensity that made the young man feel like he was being judged. There was no hint of anger in the guard's expression, but there was something else, a quiet authority that made it clear that he was in control of the situation. As the guard approached, the young tourist felt a deep sense of regret wash over him. He had always prided himself on being a respectful traveler, someone who followed the rules and tried to blend in with the culture of the places he visited. But now, standing before this disciplined figure, he could see that he had failed to live up to those ideals. He had disrespected not just the guard, but the entire tradition that the guard represented. The crowd that had been quietly watching the scene unfold began to murmur. Some people whispered to each other, exchanging glances, while others simply stared. The tourist could feel their eyes on him, and it only added to the weight of the situation. His face flushed with embarrassment, and he suddenly wished he could disappear. He had never felt so small. As the guard reached him, he stopped just a few feet away. The horse, which had been restless at first, now stood still, as if it had calmed down from the initial shock. The guard didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked down at the young tourist, his gaze unwavering. It was as though he was silently assessing him, measuring whether the tourist understood the gravity of his mistake. The silence stretched on, and the young man couldn't help but feel every second of it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the guard spoke. His voice was low and firm, but there was no harshness in it. "You have disrespected the horse," he said simply, "and you have disrespected the rules that we follow here." The words hit the tourist like a ton of bricks. He had never imagined that something as small as splashing water at a horse could lead to such a serious situation. He had thought the horse would simply shake it off, and he could go on with his sightseeing. But now, the reality of what he had done was sinking in. The guard continued, his voice calm but filled with authority. "This horse is not a mere animal. It is trained, and it has a duty to perform. The people who stand here, as I do, are not just guards. We are representatives of tradition and honor. What you did was not only disrespectful to the horse, but also to what it symbolizes." The young tourist felt a knot form in his stomach. He had never thought about it that way. To him, the horse was just a part of the scene, something to marvel at and take pictures of. But now he understood that it was far more than that. It was a symbol of history, of duty, and of respect, a respect he had failed to show. The guard took a step back, his eyes still focused on the tourist. "You will not be punished for this," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But you will remember this lesson." There was a brief pause before he added, "I hope you will learn to respect the traditions of the places you visit, and I hope you will think twice before acting again." The words were not harsh, but they carried weight. The young tourist stood there, silently processing what had just been said. He felt a deep sense of shame, but also a sense of gratitude. The guard had not punished him. He had not escalated the situation. Instead, he had chosen to teach him a lesson that would stay with the tourist for a long time. As the guard turned to walk back to his horse, the young man felt a wave of relief. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, and the crowd, which had been watching with bated breath, seemed to relax as well. The horse, which had been so agitated moments before, was now calm once more, standing with its head held high, as if nothing had happened. The guard climbed back onto the horse with ease, his posture as dignified as ever. The young tourist watched them both, his heart still racing but slowly calming down. He had learned something important today, something he would never forget. He had learned that even small actions, like a splash of water, could have unintended consequences. He had learned that respect was not something to be taken lightly, and that traditions, no matter how old or unfamiliar, deserved to be honored. As he turned to leave the area, the crowd around him seemed to have forgotten the incident, but he would never forget it. The lesson he had learned would stay with him, guiding him as he continued his travels, reminding him to approach the world with more thoughtfulness and respect than he ever had before. As the young tourist watched the guard calmly remount his horse, a sense of relief washed over him. For a moment, he thought everything would go back to normal. The tension in the air seemed to have lifted, and the crowd around him began to disperse, their attention turning back to the sights of the historical site. But the young man couldn't shake off the weight of the situation. The guard's words echoed in his mind, reminding him of his carelessness, and how something as small as a splash of water had almost caused more trouble than he could have imagined. The guard and his horse stood poised, back in their original positions as though nothing had happened. The horse's calm demeanor only made the tourist feel more guilty. It was clear now that the horse had not just been startled, it had been trained for discipline and readiness. This wasn't just any horse. This was a part of the ceremonial traditions that had stood for centuries. And yet, he had acted without understanding, without respect for the sacredness of the moment. As he stood there, watching the guard and horse, a thought began to form in his mind. He had seen countless photos of the royal guards from tourists who had visited this place before, and they had all seemed to be smiling and enjoying the experience. But now he realized those photos were only a small snapshot of something much bigger, a piece of history that deserved to be respected, not just for its aesthetic value, but for its significance to the people and culture it represented. For the first time, he wondered what it must feel like to be a guard here, to stand at attention for hours, and to be so connected to the traditions of the past. The guard didn't look angry, but there was a certain stoic quality about him that made the tourist think there was more to this job than just standing still and looking impressive. He understood now that the guards were not there for show. They were there because they had a duty to uphold, one that required patience, focus, and discipline. The young tourist began to reflect on his own actions. He had taken the opportunity to get closer to the horse, thinking it was just a harmless gesture, but now he saw how wrong he was. What he had done wasn't a simple mistake. It was a disruption to the delicate balance that had been established over centuries. And although he hadn't meant any harm, the reality of his actions had hit him hard. As the guard stood there, his eyes scanning the crowd as he resumed his watch, the tourist couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The horse, still and majestic, was the perfect companion to the guard. Together, they were a symbol of authority, strength, and history. The young man found himself thinking about how much respect they both deserved. The more he watched them, the more he understood the importance of what he had witnessed. The royal guards weren't just protecting a monument. They were protecting a legacy, and he had interrupted that in a moment of carelessness. The quiet hum of the crowd was the only sound now, and the young man, lost in his thoughts, barely noticed as people walked past him, admiring the sights. He wasn't interested in taking more photos or exploring any further at this moment. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his travels. His attention was drawn back to the guard. who remained unwavering in his post. The horse stood still, perfectly aligned with the guard's every movement. There was no sign of frustration or irritation, only calm, steady focus. The young tourist marveled at the ease with which the guard and his horse worked together. It was clear they had been through countless situations like this before, yet they responded with a professionalism that the young tourist had not expected. As the minutes passed, he could feel himself becoming more and more aware of the importance of respecting the rules, not just for the sake of avoiding trouble, but because these rules were what held everything together. They weren't just guidelines. They were a part of the fabric that made this place what it was. The traditions, the uniforms, and the horses were all pieces of something far greater than he had ever imagined. The crowd around him began to thin out as the day wore on, and the young man, still deep in thought, found himself wandering to a nearby bench. He sat down slowly, still processing everything that had happened. He couldn't help but replay the scene in his mind, the way the guard had approached him with calm authority, and how the horse had reacted. He had learned that the smallest actions could have the biggest impact, especially when you were in a place where history and tradition mattered so much. A few minutes later, the young tourist stood up and walked back towards the area where the royal guard was stationed. He didn't know if he would ever have the opportunity to meet the guard again, but if he did, he knew one thing for sure. He would be a lot more respectful. He would approach with the same reverence that the guard had shown, understanding that the traditions of this place were not to be taken lightly. As he walked back, he took a moment to appreciate the beauty of the surroundings. The historical site, with its towering buildings and statues, seemed even more meaningful now. The lesson he had learned wasn't just about respecting the horses or the guards. It was about understanding the importance of history and the responsibility that came with being a part of it. He walked away that day with a deeper appreciation for the place he had visited and a renewed commitment to being a more respectful traveler. The experience had been humbling, but it had also been enlightening. The young tourist had learned that the best way to experience a culture was not by taking shortcuts, but by showing respect and taking the time to truly understand what made it special. As the young tourist walked slowly away from the guard, the weight of the situation still hung heavily in his chest. His mind replayed the events over and over again. The splash of water, the guard's stern look, the horse's startled reaction. It all seemed like such a simple, harmless thing at the time. But now, looking back, he saw it for what it truly was, a careless mistake that could have escalated into something much worse. He found a quiet spot to sit, away from the bustling crowd. The historical site had once seemed like a picture-perfect place to explore, but now it felt much more serious, filled with meaning and responsibility. He sat on a nearby bench and looked around, taking in the beauty of the old buildings and statues that surrounded him. Everything here had a story, a purpose, and a tradition that stretched back for centuries. The royal guards, the horses, even the air seemed to hold a sense of history that made the tourist feel small in comparison. As he sat there, trying to shake off the tension, he noticed the guard again, still standing firm beside his horse. The guard had returned to his post, exactly where he had been before, his posture just as strong and proud as ever. But this time, the young tourist looked at him differently. He saw the guard not just as a figure in a uniform, but as someone who had dedicated their life to something bigger than themselves. The guard wasn't just standing there. He was part of a tradition that had been passed down through generations. The young tourist couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration. The guard's quiet strength, his calm demeanor, and his ability to remain composed in the face of potential disruption were qualities that the tourist hadn't fully understood before. But now, in the stillness of the moment, it all made sense. The guard was more than just a person with a job. He was the living embodiment of the respect, honor, and discipline that the place represented. As he sat there reflecting, the tourist began to realize how important it was to understand the significance of the places he visited. He had been so caught up in his own excitement and curiosity that he hadn't stopped to think about the deeper meanings behind the traditions he had witnessed. The guards weren't just standing watch for show. They were part of something sacred, something that deserved respect and reverence. The sound of footsteps brought him back to reality. He looked up to see a few other tourists walking past, laughing and chatting about their day. Some were taking pictures, others were admiring the views, but no one seemed to notice the guard or his horse anymore. It was as if the moment had passed, and everything had returned to normal. But for the young tourist, it was far from over. He had learned a valuable lesson today. It wasn't just about respecting the guards or the horses. It was about taking the time to understand the culture, the history, and the significance of the place he was visiting. For the first time, he realized that travel wasn't just about sightseeing and checking things off a list. It was about connecting with the places, the people, and the traditions that made those places special. And in order to do that, he needed to approach everything with respect and a deeper understanding. As the crowd around him grew, the young man felt a sense of gratitude. He was grateful for the guard's patience, for the opportunity to learn from his mistake, and for the chance to see things from a new perspective. He knew that the rest of his travels would be different from now on. Every place he visited, every tradition he encountered, would be seen through the lens of respect and understanding. He stood up from the bench and began to walk back toward the area where the guard was stationed. His steps were slow but purposeful, and his mind was clearer than it had been all day. He still felt a twinge of embarrassment, but it was fading, replaced by a sense of determination. He had made a mistake, but he had learned from it, and that was what mattered most. As he approached the guard, he took a deep breath. The guard was still standing tall, his horse beside him, watching the crowds with the same quiet vigilance he had shown before. The young tourist felt a sudden urge to thank him, to express his gratitude for the lesson he had taught him without even realizing it. He wasn't sure if the guard would acknowledge him, but he knew he had to try. "Excuse me," the young tourist said, his voice slightly nervous but sincere. The guard turned his head toward him, his expression as calm as ever. The tourist took a moment before continuing. "I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't understand what you do here, but I do now. I respect what you represent, and I'm sorry for my mistake." The guard's eyes softened for a moment, and the young tourist could see a slight nod of approval. "It's important to remember that what we do here is more than just a job," the guard said, his voice steady. "It's about preserving something important. I'm glad you understand." The young man smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He didn't expect the guard to forgive him in an instant, but the fact that he had acknowledged his apology meant more than words could express. As he turned to walk away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a tourist anymore. He was someone who had learned something valuable, something that would stay with him long after he left this place. The young tourist felt a mix of relief and gratitude as he walked away from the guard. The guard's calm words had helped ease the tension that had built up within him, and the realization that he had learned something important made him feel a little lighter. Still, he couldn't forget the embarrassment he had felt moments earlier, and his heart continued to beat a little faster than usual. He had learned the hard way, but it had been a lesson he wouldn't forget. As he wandered through the historical site, the sound of chatter from other tourists filled the air, but the young man's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about the guard, his calm authority, and the way he had handled the situation. It wasn't just about the mistake he had made. It was about how he had been able to see things from a new perspective. He had come to realize that travel wasn't just about taking pictures or enjoying the sights. It was about respecting the places and people he encountered along the way. And that respect wasn't something to be taken lightly. The young tourist passed by a few more guards stationed throughout the site, but this time he noticed them differently. He didn't just see them as figures in uniforms or as part of the scenery. He saw them as individuals with a duty, a responsibility to uphold something much greater than themselves. Each guard had their own role to play, and they did it with a sense of pride and professionalism that was evident in their every movement. It was a sense of duty that the tourist had never fully appreciated until now. He stopped in front of a statue, the figure frozen in time, and found himself reflecting on what he had learned. The historical site, with all its grandeur and beauty, had come alive in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just a place to visit. It was a place where history was preserved, where traditions were honored, and where the people who worked there played a vital role in keeping that history alive. As he stood there, the tourist felt a growing sense of humility. He had been so focused on capturing the perfect photo and checking off landmarks on his travel list that he had forgotten what it meant to truly be present. He hadn't taken the time to understand the significance of the place or the people who maintained it. He had been a visitor in the truest sense of the word, only concerned with his own experience. But now he realized that to truly experience a place, to truly appreciate it, he had to be willing to understand it on a deeper level. The quiet of the site seemed to settle around him, and for the first time that day, he felt at peace. It was as if the weight of his mistake had been lifted, and the air seemed a little fresher. The sounds of the crowd faded into the background, and he was able to focus on the beauty around him. The intricate details of the architecture, the way the light shifted on the stone walls, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Everything felt more meaningful now, more connected to the traditions and history that he had nearly overlooked. He walked a little farther, slowly, with no particular destination in mind. His thoughts were still on the guard and the lesson he had learned. He understood now that there was so much more to these traditions than he had realized. The guards, the horses, the uniforms, and even the rules, they weren't just for show. They were part of a living, breathing history that had been passed down through generations. And now, as a visitor, it was his responsibility to respect that history, to honor it in a way that wasn't just about observing, but also about understanding. The young tourist didn't know how long he had been walking, but eventually he found himself at a small cafe located within the site. It was a quiet place, away from the hustle and bustle of the main area, and he decided to sit down for a while. He ordered a drink and took a seat by the window, still thinking about what had happened earlier. The cafe was filled with tourists, some talking quietly, others sipping their drinks in silence. The atmosphere was peaceful, and it gave the young man a moment to reflect. He looked out the window, watching as the crowds continued to move through the site, unaware of the lesson that he had just learned. He realized that, in many ways, the world around him was moving faster than he had imagined. People rushed from one place to the next, eager to see everything without taking the time to stop and appreciate the significance of what they were seeing. He had been just like that, focused on the next photo or the next destination, without understanding the deeper meaning of his journey. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. This wasn't the kind of trip he had planned when he first set out to visit the historical site. He had imagined taking countless photos and exploring every corner of the place. But now he saw the value in taking a step back, in slowing down and appreciating the moment. Sometimes the most valuable lessons came not from the places you visited or the things you saw, but from the moments of reflection and understanding that came with being present. As the young tourist sat there, sipping his drink, he realized that his travels had changed. They weren't just about the sights and experiences anymore. They were about the connections he made to the places he visited, the people he met, and the lessons he learned along the way. He understood that the world was full of history, full of stories waiting to be discovered, but those stories could only be understood if you took the time to truly listen and learn. And that was a lesson worth remembering. As the young tourist continued to walk through the historical site, his thoughts were still heavy with the lesson he had just learned. He couldn't stop thinking about the guard, his calm yet firm words, and the way he had handled the situation with such poise and professionalism. It wasn't just about the incident with the water. It was about the way the guard had shown him how to truly respect the traditions and history of the place. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how much he had taken for granted in the past. He found himself walking slowly, almost aimlessly, as he explored the site. It was as if he was seeing everything with new eyes. The towering buildings, the statues, and even the quiet corners of the grounds seemed to have a new significance. He no longer saw them just as tourist attractions, but as pieces of history that had been carefully preserved over generations. And it wasn't just the physical structures that held importance. It was the traditions, the stories, and the people who had dedicated their lives to keeping them alive. The tourist paused for a moment, standing at the edge of a garden. The scent of the flowers was sweet, and the colors of the blooms were more vibrant than he had noticed before. He breathed deeply, taking in the scene around him. Everything felt different now, more connected, more meaningful. He had never realized how much he had been missing in his previous travels, always rushing from one place to the next, trying to see as much as possible without truly taking the time to appreciate what he was experiencing. As he stood there, lost in thought, he noticed a small group of tourists nearby. They were laughing and talking excitedly, taking photos with their phones, just as he had done earlier. He couldn't help but watch them for a moment, feeling a sense of disconnection. They seemed so focused on capturing the perfect picture, on getting the right angle for their social media posts. He remembered how he had been just like that, eager to show off his travels without truly understanding the significance of the places he was visiting. But now he felt a sense of distance from that mindset. He had learned that true appreciation wasn't about the photos you took or the stories you told. It was about the way you respected and honored the culture, the history, and the people you encountered. The young man smiled to himself as he thought back to the guard's words. "Respect the traditions," he had said. At the time, those words had felt like a simple reprimand, but now they carried so much more weight. It was a reminder that every place had its own unique history, its own set of rules and traditions that deserved to be understood and respected. And that respect wasn't something you could just pay lip service to. It had to come from a deeper place, a place of genuine curiosity and appreciation for the world around you. As the crowd continued to wander past him, the tourist felt a sense of clarity. It was as if everything had fallen into place, and the pieces of his experience were finally coming together. He knew that from now on, he would approach every new place with a sense of mindfulness, a desire to understand and connect with it on a deeper level. He would listen to the stories, learn about the culture, and respect the traditions that made each place unique. With this new perspective, he felt more present than ever before. He could feel the history beneath his feet, in the stones of the buildings, in the whispers of the wind through the trees. Everything around him seemed to be alive with meaning. The tourist realized that, in a way, he had been living in a bubble of his own, so caught up in his own experiences that he hadn't stopped to truly understand the world he was traveling through. Now, he understood that to really experience a place, you had to open yourself up to it, to be willing to slow down and take the time to see it for what it truly was. He spent the next few hours wandering through the site, taking in the details that he had missed earlier. He no longer rushed from one attraction to the next, checking things off a list. Instead, he allowed himself to fully experience each moment. He looked at the carvings on the walls, noticed the small details in the architecture, and took in the sounds and smells of the place. It wasn't about capturing the perfect photo anymore. It was about capturing the essence of the place in his mind, letting it seep into his memory so that he could carry it with him long after he left. The young tourist found a quiet spot near a fountain and sat down, his mind calm and focused. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lesson he had learned, for the opportunity to experience something so much more meaningful than he had expected. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and he was now able to see the world in a way that was richer and more fulfilling. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the historical site, the young man knew that he would carry this experience with him for the rest of his life. He had come to understand that true travel wasn't just about seeing the world. It was about connecting with it, respecting it, and learning from it. And with that new understanding, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue his journey with a deeper appreciation for the places he visited and the people he met along the way. As the young tourist continued his walk, He found himself reflecting on the words the guard had spoken to him earlier. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that something had changed within him. He had come to the site seeking a quick adventure, hoping to see the sights, take some photos, and tick another destination off his list. But now, he realized, the experience had turned into something far more profound. It was no longer just about sightseeing. It was about understanding, respecting, and connecting with the culture around him. He had learned an invaluable lesson that would stick with him long after he left this place. He decided to return to the area where he had first interacted with the guard. The place was quiet now, with fewer tourists walking around. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the stone pathways and creating a peaceful atmosphere. It seemed like the perfect time to revisit the spot, to reflect on everything that had happened. The young man felt a sense of peace, a calm that he hadn't felt before. He wasn't in a rush anymore. He didn't need to hurry to the next attraction, to capture the perfect photo, or to check off another box on his travel list. For the first time in a long time, he felt content just being where he was. As he approached the guard again, he noticed that the man was still standing by his horse, perfectly poised, just as he had been earlier. The horse, too, stood tall and still, as if nothing had disturbed it. The young tourist couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration. The guard hadn't just returned to his post. He had done so with unwavering focus and dedication. It was as if the earlier incident had never happened, as if the guard's sense of duty remained unaffected by the small disruption. The tourist stood at a distance, watching the guard in silence. He realized that this was more than just a job for the man. It was a way of life, a way of embodying respect for tradition and for the history that the site represented. The young tourist had seen the guard as a figure in a uniform before, but now he saw him as someone who was part of a larger story, a story that stretched back through generations of people who had worked to preserve the site's legacy. The young man was overcome with a sense of gratitude. He wasn't sure if the guard even knew the impact he had had on him, but he knew he couldn't leave without expressing his thanks. Slowly, he walked toward the guard, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. The guard turned to face him, and the young tourist could see a hint of recognition in his eyes. There was no sign of anger or frustration, just a calm acknowledgement that the young man had returned. "I just wanted to say thank you." The tourist continued, his voice soft but genuine. "I know it was just a small thing, but what you said to me earlier, it made me realize something important. I've been traveling for a long time, but I've never really understood the places I visit until now. I was rushing through everything, trying to get the perfect picture, but I didn't take the time to truly appreciate what I was seeing. What you said about respecting the traditions, it really made me think. I'm sorry for my earlier mistake, but I also want to thank you for helping me see things differently." The guard listened in silence, his face impassive, but his eyes softening as the tourist spoke. After a moment, he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the sincerity of the young man's words. "It's good to learn from your mistakes," the guard said, his voice still calm, but with a trace of understanding. "Travel is about more than just visiting new places. It's about learning, about respecting the history and the people who have kept those traditions alive. I'm glad you understand now." The tourist felt a sense of warmth in his chest. It wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the guard's willingness to listen, to allow him the space to reflect and express his gratitude. It felt like a small but meaningful exchange, one that spoke to the heart of what travel was truly about. The young man smiled, feeling lighter than he had all day. He had come to the site looking for adventure, but what he had found was something much more valuable. A lesson in humility, respect, and understanding. And in a way, he felt that the encounter with the guard had opened his eyes to a new way of experiencing the world. As the evening drew on, the young tourist took one last look at the historical site. The crowds had mostly thinned, and the air was cooler now, but the place felt different to him. It was no longer just a tourist attraction. It was a living, breathing part of history, and he was grateful to have been a part of it, even if only for a short while. Before he left, he took a deep breath, feeling a sense of contentment settle within him. He knew that the rest of his travels would be different from now on. He would take the time to learn, to connect, and to appreciate the places he visited on a deeper level. And most importantly, he would always remember the lesson he had learned here. That true travel was about more than just seeing the sights. It was about understanding and respecting the history, culture, and people that made each place unique. With a final glance at the guard and his horse, the tourist turned and walked away, knowing that this experience would stay with him long after he left. As the young tourist made his way toward the exit of the historical site, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace that had settled in him over the course of the day. The sun was now low in the sky, casting long shadows over the stone pathways, and the cool evening air seemed to wrap around him like a comforting embrace. He had come here seeking an experience, looking to add another page to his travel journal, but he was leaving with something much more meaningful, a deep appreciation for the place, its history, and the people who preserved it. He paused for a moment before stepping out, turning back to take one last look at the historical site. The guards were still there, standing tall, their presence as strong as ever. And the horses, serene and majestic, remained perfectly still, as if keeping watch over the past. The young tourist thought about the encounter with the guard earlier, the lesson he had learned, and the transformation he had experienced. What had started as a simple, careless act had turned into a profound lesson in respect, understanding, and mindfulness. As he stood there, a realization washed over him. The guard had been right. Travel wasn't about just seeing new places. It was about experiencing them in a way that honored their history and culture. It was about taking the time to learn, to listen, and to truly understand the stories that each place had to tell. In the rush to capture the perfect photo or check off another landmark, he had lost sight of the deeper meaning behind the journey. But now, he understood that the essence of travel lay in those moments of reflection, in those quiet lessons that came from respecting the traditions and histories of the places you visited. The young man had spent the rest of the day walking the grounds of the historical site, observing things he hadn't noticed before, the intricate carvings on the walls, the way the sunlight caught on the old stone buildings, the faint smell of the earth beneath his feet. He had taken the time to absorb it all, to be present in each moment. The experience had become more than just a visit. It had become a personal journey of growth and awareness. He thought about his future travels, knowing that they would be different from now on. He would approach every new place with a renewed sense of respect and mindfulness. He would no longer rush through experiences, trying to collect memories like souvenirs. Instead, he would take the time to connect with each place, to understand its history and culture, and to honor the people who had kept those traditions alive for generations. He realized that it was these connections that would make his travels truly meaningful. As he walked away from the site, he felt a sense of contentment in his heart. He had learned something valuable, not just about the place he had visited, but about himself. He had learned to slow down, to appreciate the present moment, and to respect the histories that shaped the world around him. It wasn't just about the landmarks or the photographs. It was about the stories they told and the lessons they carried. The young man's mind wandered back to the guard, standing silently beside his horse, guarding not just the site, but the memories of those who had come before him. The guard had shown him that sometimes the most important lessons weren't spoken in words, but in actions. It was the guard's unwavering commitment to his duty, his respect for tradition, and his calm presence that had made such an impact. The young tourist realized that the guard wasn't just a symbol of authority. He was a living embodiment of the respect and discipline that the historical site represented. As he neared the exit, he saw a few tourists still lingering, some chatting excitedly, others taking last-minute photos. The young man smiled softly to himself. He wasn't judging them. After all, there was nothing wrong with wanting to capture a memory, but he now understood that there was more to travel than just collecting snapshots. The real memories were the ones that stayed with you long after you left, the ones that taught you something about the world and about yourself. The gate came into view, and with it, the bustling world beyond. But for the first time in a long while, the young tourist didn't feel the usual rush to move on, to check the next destination off his list. Instead, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the lessons he had learned at the historical site would stay with him. They would shape how he viewed the world from now on, making his future travels more meaningful, more thoughtful, and more connected to the places he visited. As he stepped through the gate and into the street beyond, he turned back one last time. The historical site stood tall behind him, its ancient stones whispering the stories of the past. The young man knew that he would always carry those stories with him, not just as a memory, but as a guide for how to live more mindfully and respectfully in the world. With a heart full of gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose, he continued on his journey, ready to embrace the world in a new way.